You know, it brings up a comment I want to make. It's really hard to separate the international aspect of it. Let's look at RGGI. We have a cap and trade program, albeit a niche within a niche, let's say. 3.3% of RGGI's carbon allotment, or the cap, can come from what they call the voluntary market. The voluntary market is international. There are international markets. So, you know, last November, Schwarzenegger has the Governor's Global Climate Summit, and people from the UN and China, and it's a global summit at a state level. It almost seems, you know, that some boundary's been crossed between political sovereignty, right? I mean, here we have international agencies interacting with states. We can't separate the voluntary carbon market and the mechanisms, which is in the paper. I didn't cover it here. It's in the paper that you've got from here. It talks about the clean development mechanism, joint implementation. I mean, we need to understand the political science of this. So since we can't separate carbon from the voluntary portion from the international community, we're getting a lot of pressure. We're getting a lot of pressure. You know, we're getting lobbying that wouldn't normally be in national legislation. So I just wanted to mention that. Jim, did you have a comment back there?
Well, I was just going to comment that, I mean, one thing I think the group needs to be aware of, and we'll talk a little bit about this in the afternoon and folks that come there, is regardless of what happens in Congress, and I agree with your sentiments about the legislation, but regardless of what happens, there's going to be action by EPA, because if that passes Congress, that's the first step. The next step is EPA is going to write implementing regulations that implement what Congress told them to do. So if they have the framework under those numbers you put up there, EPA will do one thing. Lacking that, EPA is still going to be writing regulations, and they might still look a lot like that legislation at some point. But this is going to happen. It's happening as we speak, and we need to be prepared.